Fallout Equestria the Chrysalis, Chapter 23, Part 3. The dark desert floor passed beneath me, the wind flowing silently under the wings of my chimeric body. Normally, I would avoid a form that blatantly combined elements of different races or species, much as I'd avoid any other disguise that stood out as unusual. However, at the moment, function trumped appearance, and the difficulty of incorporating such fine alterations was well worth the result. At the moment, my form was mostly like that of the so-called bat ponies, with golden-slit pupil eyes that soaked in what little light penetrated the nighttime cloud cover, and large tufted ears that easily picked up any wayward sound in the still night air. All of that was complemented by the dark charcoal coat, blending in with the dark clouds above. While already unusual enough just by virtue of the rare breed, my form stood out even further with the wings. Rather than the membranous wings would expect, I sported a pair of feathered wings. But they were not a normal pony's wings. They were thick and soft, with carefully arranged feathers and edge-shaped to minimize the sound that they made passing through the air. A skilled observer would recognize the wings as belonging not to a Pegasus, but an owl. My unusual appearance was of little importance. Success depended not on blending in, but in never being seen in the first place. I had cast off most of my belongings in the name of stealth. I had only two tools that would be useful for this stage of the plan, and so they were all I carried. One was Emerald's pip-buck, clasped to my foreleg, mid-screen turned off to avoid giving away my position, and the other was my pistol, strapped to my shoulder with its two spare magazines. I entered a shallow bank as I passed over the raider compound once more. It was my third pass, each lower than the last. Tick marks on my EFS lazily drifted off to my side as I passed by. I confirmed my previous count, 9 red marks and not a single green. There were lights in the compound, but only a few. Most were inside, sending narrow blades of light through the loosely fitted boards, and only 2 lights were outside, one in each of the watchtowers. Their feeble light lit up the inside of the tower itself and little else. Likely they were so the ponies could find their way across the darkened rooftops and walkways. But to me, they were a mixed blessing. On the one hoof, the light would impede the night vision of the ponies who stood guard, leaving me effectively invisible outside of the short radius of their glow. But on the other hoof, they illuminated the 2 places I absolutely had to go to. 2 raiders remained standing guard after nightfall, although standing was something of a misnomer. My pass revealed that both were laid back in their towers. While the mare by the front gate was tipping back a bottle to drink, and thus clearly awake, the stallion in the rear tower had his chin tucked in against his chest, apparently asleep. Only 1 step remained before committing myself. I turned my head, teeth clasping down on the bit of my pistol, and drew it. I checked that the magazine was full, the safety was disengaged, and a round was chambered. With a slow, deep breath, I pitched down, tightening my turn as I descended towards the gateside watchtower. I flared my wings, feathers fluttering near silently as I bled off energy, keeping my glide nice and slow. My turn took me over the rear tower, then across the old barracks building. By the time I was closing in on the front tower, I was perfectly level with it, and coming from directly behind the relaxed and unaware raider. I backwinged, bleeding off the last of my speed as the faint light in the tower started to illuminate my dark coat. Even as silent as my form was, there's only so much that one can do to mask the passage of a pony-sized object through the air. The raider mare's ear twitched in response to some barely heard sound or faint air current, but I didn't give her the time to consider it further. I was barely a yard away and in a hover when I pulled the trigger. My weapon gave a sharp clack, like a hammer striking a nail, and the bullet smashed into the back of her head with an audible smack. The mare jerked and spasmed with startling violence, sending her bottle clattering to the floor and kicking the wall of the tower. I hurtled myself forward, diving into the tower. I grappled with her flailing limbs as I placed the tip of my suppressor against her head and fired again, but she gave no reaction, nor did it stop her movements. She continued spasming, emitting a weak, wet gurgle. I simply held on, trying to muffle the sound as much as possible. Within seconds, the spasming weakened and soon stilled, though her body remained tense, her legs at full extension. Her eyes were still open, unseeing, her expression slack as blood dribbled from the back of her skull. Once she had stopped, we lay together, still and silent. The walls of the tower concealed us from the other guard's position, but only if he didn't wake and investigate the sound of struggling. I heard nothing but my own heartbeat hammering away. My attention turned to my EFS. None of the red marks were moving. I waited another 10 seconds or so before hazarding a peek over the watchtower walls. The other guard was still out of sight, presumably still dozing and unaware of what had happened to his compatriot. I huffed out a quiet sigh of relief, then turned to the lantern. It was a simple spark-powered camping lantern, its dim light painful against my night-adjusted eyes. I turned it off, plunging the inside of the tower into darkness. I stepped out, carefully unfurling my wings and slowly beat them. It was just enough to stay level as I crossed the courtyard to the other tower. Flying was more assuredly quiet than risking a walk on those ancient roofs, even as sturdy as they looked. My ears picked up his faint snoring as I came up to the tower, and I back-winged again, coming to a halt right at its entrance. With all the time in the world, I carefully aimed at the center of his sleeping face and pulled the trigger. Once again, the sharp clack of my weapon echoed in the still night. The stallion twitched with the impact, but that was the extent of it. The casing clattering across the roof produced more noise than he did. I slipped into the tower, extinguishing the lantern there, and sat in silence once more. Still no sounds of ponies coming to investigate, still no movement on my EFS. So far, everything had worked out perfectly. I flew back to the front tower. After another cautious glance around, I lifted my left foreleg, placing the attached pip buck across the top of the wall, pointing out. I turned on the screen with the brightness set low and turned it off again. I repeated the action twice more, then left it off. The hulk of ruined skywagons and other metal decorations stretched out from the gate. Even with my altered eyes, I could only make out the closest in any detail. The rest rapidly turned to silhouettes, slightly lighter shapes against the darkness beyond. Out in the distance past the end of the wreckage, a faint green glow flickered into life, vanishing an instant later. I turned back, watching over the rest of the compound for any ponies who might intrude. Mostly, I just watched the addition built atop the two-story building. A door opened on the roof, and from the light seeping through the cracks, I assumed at least one of the pips Emerald's pip buck showed was inside there. Every few seconds, I'd glance back outside the walls. Soon, green pips started to appear, superimposed over the EFS's compass. Not long after, I could hear the rattle and clank of Sickle's armor approaching. I waited, keeping my eyes out for threats until they had reached the base of the wall beside me. I slipped out from the tower and over the wall, dropping down to the ground with a quick flutter of my wings. Starlight and Dusty crouched behind an overturned skywagon with crude spikes protruding from it. Starlight's lancer was still strapped across her back. Instead, she held Emerald's magic energy rifle in her teeth. Sickle, meanwhile, stood directly in the front gate, unconcerned. Dusty stepped out to crouch beside me, and I quickly filled him in.
Single story has 2 raiders,
I whispered, lifting a hoof to point to the left.
South side of the building, I can clear that silently once we're inside. 2-story.
My hoof swung to the right.
Has 5, spread out along it. There were 2 more in the towers, but I took care of them already.
Dusty gave a sharp nod, his rifle bobbing with emotion, and stood. With a near-silent flurry of my wings, I floated over him, wrapping my forelegs around his barrel and lifted. It was a thankfully short flight to the roof of the taller building. I deposited him there, and as he crouched to cover the approaches, I descended again. Starlight stepped out as I drew near, clutching the rest of my belongings, and I lifted her as well. Once I had released her, she crouched beside Dusty. In the overcast darkness, with the uneven wall top as a backdrop, they were as good as invisible to a normal pony. Moving to the edge of the roof, I gave the courtyard a more thorough looking over. It looked trashed. More Skywagon and Motor Wagon wrecks lined either side of the courtyard, forming a crude wall of metal hulks. A single rusted-out tank sat at the back of the courtyard, missing its tracks and hatches. The huge machine gun atop the turret was the only thing that appeared to be in good condition, and I could see it was loaded. The ground itself was torn up, and even cratered in places with bits of debris scattered randomly. Even with my enhanced nighttime eyes, I couldn't make out all of the details. I found myself relieved by that. I was fairly certain that some of the debris was body parts. There were no ponies, and it didn't appear that any of the angry red marks on the EFS compass were near the doors. I slipped over the edge and dropped to the ground. The gate was barred by a single metal beam which produced only a faint squeak as I removed it. The gate creaked open to show Sickle's hulking form through the opening. I stepped back, and she walked in, armor rattling with each step. Once she was inside, I held up a hoof. She halted, though the way her head turned to me indicated that she was glaring underneath that helmet. But that was fine by me. She had been patient so far, and that was about the best I could ask for. She'd have the opportunity to act soon enough. But first, I had one more thing I wanted to take care of. Since the 2 hostile contacts in the single-story building were on the south end, near the back of the compound, I entered through the door near the north end. My suspicions were proven correct. It was a barracks building of some sort, mostly open space, though that same space was filled with boxes, barrels, and heaps of junk. The light at the southern end struggled to reach my end of the building, leaving me creeping along carefully, barely able to see my hooves. A small room along one side, perhaps a commanding officer's office or bedroom, offered me both a moment of rest and an opportunity to change my form. With a flash of magic hidden by those walls, I stripped away my disguise, returning to my natural form, with my as-yet unused armor. I did perform one slight alteration, and hid my fangs. Gripping my pistol in my mouth would be impossible with them, and I couldn't risk the glow my magic would produce while holding it. The altered dentistry with my sharper omnivorous teeth changed how the grip fit in my mouth, but it was easy to shift the bit around and align the sights once more. I slipped out of the office again and started slowly picking my way across the junk-filled space. I could already hear the two raiders ahead of me. There was a stallion and a mare, but with the way that they were grunting and panting on top of the rapid creaking of well-worn furniture, I suspected the chances of them hearing my approach were minimal. As I drew closer, the light grew enough that I could clearly make out the objects that I was passing. Most of it seemed to be junk, random tools, worn clothing and bags, the broken remains of a cart and other rubbish like that. Army crates with stenciled words faded by 2 centuries lined the other side of the room. Closer to the raiders, the space was filled with barrels, presumably full of water and heaps of food. Others were loose vegetables, which I imagined had been taken from the farm that they had just hit. Rounding a pile of discarded cans and boxes, I could see part of the final room, bathed in the light of a bare bulb. From the half of it I could see on my approach, it appeared to be serving as a crude kitchen, with a rickety stove and numerous knives and pans. There was also a table, with the hacked-up remains of a pony lying atop of it. At first, I thought I think it had been a mare, had been badly burned and maimed. Then I realized that wasn't quite accurate. She had been cooked. Her legs were missing, and enough of her chest had been carved away to reveal ribs. The metal spit was even still there, piercing through her pelvis and out of her mouth. Several slabs of meat lay on a stained platter at the edge of the table. I stared, simply processing that for several seconds before I realized the sounds further in the room had stopped. I could still hear the rapid panning of the two raiders, but the sounds of copulation had ceased. Yeah, that's what we're gonna end off. The end of them having sex. That's it. Christ almighty. Anyway, let's get on to our blessed donators. Top donators are 630, J Tinman, Darkside, Only One Thing, Dash of Evergreen, and Ceru Orion. Rayden, Narwhals, Blackmoonheart, Pastel Skies, Austin Roland's Crazy Killer 557, Stu Hex, Sword Brother, Mordred, Omicron, Lyrae, Will, Chris, Twinkie, Hudzaza, Ride Soul, Iron Sky, Badass Waffle, and many more fantabulous people. Thank you all so much for watching this video and live life to the fullest.